Welcome to Conservatism 101 and the Leadership Institute. I want to begin by thanking Morton Blackwell and the Institute for this initiative, which is so important to give people an appreciation of what conservatism is all about. And I think that once again, Morton and the Leadership Institute has come forward with a first in conservatism. Before there was Ronald Reagan, there was Barry Goldwater. And before there was Barry Goldwater, there was Robert A. Taft. From the late 1930s through the early 1950s, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio led the Republican resistance to the attempts of the New Deal and its successors to transform America into a liberal welfare state. Senator Taft was not your ordinary pol. He didn't slap backs, he didn't twist arms, and he didn't sip a little bourbon and branch in the back room with the boys. He became the most powerful Republican in the Senate and the national leader of traditional Republicans through his formidable intellect, his huge appetite for work, and his political integrity. Now, Taft described himself as a liberal conservative. By liberal, he meant someone who is willing to accept change, who believes in freedom for others, and is sufficiently open-minded to be able to consider any proposal that is made to him. By conservative, he meant someone who knows and appreciates the importance of stability. While I'm willing and ready to consider changes, he said, I want to be darn sure, and that he emphasized this, darned sure, that they are really better than what we have. His guiding principle as a legislator, he said, was whether a policy increases or decreases the liberty of our people. That principle, to preserve the liberty of the people, is the key to understanding Robert Taft. Now, he supported equality of opportunity, whereby all men and women could rise from obscurity. Now, notice that word opportunity, not results. But he also said that government must provide a floor through which no one should be permitted to fall. And he believed in a humane economy founded upon Christian moral principles and upon the American historical experience rooted in the Constitution. He supported federal aid to education, health, and housing, but he insisted that the administration of all such programs must be placed in the hands of state and local authorities. I would describe Taft as an early fusionist, someone who reflected both the libertarian and the traditional strains of conservatism, sometimes tilting to the traditional philosophy and other times the libertarian. But such distinctions rarely occurred to him. He wasn't a political philosopher. He was a practicing politician. Now, he occasionally read political books and sometimes quoted John Stuart Mill from On Liberty in his speeches, but when a reporter asked him once whether he had read Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, Taft shook his head and chuckled. You remind me of James Thurber's Let Your Mind Alone. He then added, there are some questions I've just not thought very much about, but I'm a politician, not a philosopher. But what a conservative politician he was, consider. In the 1946 elections, Republicans had the opportunity to make the first significant gains in the Congress since 1928, and they adopted the slogan, had enough, vote Republican. The country was buffeted by rising inflation, stagnant economic growth, high prices, and hundreds, if not thousands, of strikes. President Truman woke up the morning after election night with a bad cold and a solidly Republican Congress. The decisive Republican victory of 1946 was in fact based on conservative themes like cutting taxes, balancing the budget, and containing and turning back communism. But conservatism didn't really exist in any formal sense at this time in the 1940s. There was only one explicitly conservative publication, Human Events, which at the time was an 8-page weekly newsletter. There were no political or intellectual organizations, no ACU, no YAF, no Right to Work Committee, no Right to Life Committee, no Heritage Foundation, no ISI, no Leadership Institute. No prominent philosopher, popularizer, or politician called himself a conservative. Friedrich Hayek, author of The Road to Serfdom, the most influential book of those early days, insisted he wasn't a conservative, but a classical liberal. However, with their majority, Taft and his Republican colleagues had a golden opportunity to implement conservative ideas in the new Congress, the so-called Do-Nothing 80th Congress. By the end of the first session, Republicans had succeeded in cutting Truman's budget by 7.5%. I emphasize, they didn't slow the growth of government spending or even freeze spendings. They cut spending by 7.5%. At the same time, Taft, the leader, pushed hard for tax cuts. Federal, state, and local taxes, he said, represented 30% of the national income. Tax reduction, he insisted, was, quote, essential to the welfare of the country because the present heavy burden of taxation is an evil in itself. The Taft plan of reduced government spending and tax cuts was a 1940s version of 1980 supply-side economics, of what came to be called Reaganomics. Taft's major personal achievement was securing passage of the Taft-Hartley Labor Act, a much-needed reform of the Wagner Labor Act of 1935. Taft-Hartley did what? Banned the closed shop, instituted the secret ballot for workers, made secondary boycotts illegal, and allowed states to outlaw the union shop. The last provision, Section 14B, was the most far-reaching. It gave workers the right not to join a union. Since then, some 24 states have become right-to-work states, the most recent, Michigan, significantly reducing the political power of organized labor, which depends upon forced dues for its political action. In foreign policy, Taft supported the Truman Doctrine of aid to Greece and Turkey and the Marshall Plan, intended to help the economically weakened nations of Western Europe, because, he said, America was engaged in an ideological battle of freedom against communism. But he opposed NATO because it would be the first time America had joined a military alliance in peacetime. In the summer of 1948, President Truman's political fate seemed sealed. He would be defeated by almost any Republican challenger. Confident Republicans assembled in Philadelphia for their national convention, and they nominated, though, not Robert Taft, who had led the 80th Congress through 2 productive years, but Thomas Dewey, the mustachioed New York governor who had given Franklin D. Roosevelt a close race in 1944. Republicans cast their vote with Dewey, who looked like the little man on the wedding cake because of his superior standing in the polls against Truman, and because the Eastern liberal establishment still controlled the Republican Party at this time. In the fall came. President Truman went on the attack, calling the 80th Congress a do-nothing Congress, which, as we have seen, was the reverse of reality. Truman described the Republican platform as the most deceitful document in history, and Dewey a captive of evil Wall Street. Rather than respond to these gross misrepresentations, Dewey kept to the high road, promised constructive change, whatever that meant, offered few specifics, and lost in one of the biggest upsets in modern politics, receiving 45% of the popular vote to Truman's 50%. Well, as disappointed as they were about the outcome, traditional Republicans reassured themselves the party had learned an important lesson. It would not nominate again a candidate who failed to go on the offensive against his opponent or take decisive stands on the issues. And so we come to 1952. And that race for the Republican presidential nomination, which was essentially between Dwight D. Eisenhower, the candidate of the Eastern Liberal Wing, and Robert Taft, the candidate of the Midwestern Conservative Wing, between pragmatists indifferent to principle but eager to win, and idealists for whom principle was as important as victory. On July 6th, the day before the National Republican Convention opened in Chicago, Taft claimed that he had 530 delegates who were pledged to him until, as he put it, hell freezes over. And he needed only 604 delegates to secure the nomination. Most observers were agreed Taft would prevail. But the Eisenhower forces challenged accredited delegates from the South. In Texas, for example, Republicans, regular ones, met and selected 30 delegates for Taft, only 4 for Eisenhower. Eisenhower Republicans met separately and picked 33 Eisenhower delegates and 5 Taft delegates. So 2 Texas delegations showed up in Chicago, each claiming to be the legitimate representatives of the Lone Star State. The convention officials who would decide which delegation should be seated were all pro-Taft Republicans, a fact which the Eisenhower managers seized on. It's true, masked bandits with guns roamed the Chicago streets, carrying placards that read, "Taft steals votes," while oversized signs appeared proclaiming that RAT, R-A-T, stood for Robert A. Taft. Eisenhower himself vowed to fight to keep the party clean and fit to lead the nation, and he demanded fair play. Party officials flinched and then surrendered, seating the Eisenhower delegates. The convention delegates really wanted to nominate Taft, but they went with Ike. The reason was to be found again in the polls, which showed Eisenhower handily defeating the presumed Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson, while Taft was in a near tie with Stevenson. As one historian wrote, Republicans love Taft, but they love victory more. But General Eisenhower would not have won that fall unless Senator Taft had pledged his unqualified support, thus uniting the Republican Party. Ike captured 55.4% of the popular vote for president. He racked up 442 electoral votes, and importantly, cracked the solid South for the first time, carrying Florida, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. And his coattails enabled Republicans to win narrow majorities in both houses of Congress. Regular Republicans asked themselves, what if Taft, rather than Eisenhower, had headed the ticket? Taft himself was convinced he would have defeated Stevenson. He believed that the independent vote would have gone, as it did in his 1950 senatorial campaign, to an aggressive, articulate candidate like himself. And the pollster Samuel Lubell agreed, telling a Washington audience that while Taft wouldn't have won by as large a margin as Eisenhower, he would have been elected. Well, never one to dwell on the past and what might have been. Taft thought that with himself as the head of the legislative branch and Eisenhower as the head of the executive branch, that he and Ike would make a highly effective team for their party and the nation. Tragically, they had little opportunity to forge a meaningful relationship because only 5 short months later, Robert Taft was dead of cancer. Without Taft, the dynamics of the Republican Party shifted dramatically. There was no effective counterweight to the modern republicanism of the Eisenhower administration. Almost single-handedly, Robert Taft had strengthened and shaped the conservative strain in the American character, demonstrating that change was not to be feared, but blended and harmonized with the historical experience of the nation. His accomplishments, as outlined by Russell Kirk, were significant. I say almost single-handedly, he revived the GOP from the late 1930s through the early 1950s, when no one else was doing it. He proclaimed that there should be liberty, but liberty under law, that we are a government of laws and not of people. He believed in a humane economy, by which he meant that no one should be allowed to fall beneath a particular floor. He brought about, for the first time in almost 25 years, a balance between management and labor, particularly with the right to work provision for states, in that no particular worker was being forced to join a union in which to hold a job. And finally, he prudently and rationally criticized U.S. foreign policy, supporting the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, but opposing NATO. It was an extraordinary accomplishment by just one individual, with very little of a staff, doing most of this by himself. 4 years after his death, Taft was elected to the Senate Hall of Fame, joining John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and Robert La Follette Sr. The five men, it was said, transcended party and state lines and left a permanent mark on our nation's history. Robert Taft, Mr. Republican, was the first of four Misters who dominated American conservatism in the last half of the 20th century to the present day. The second Mister was Mr. Conservative, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona.